Hello everyone, welcome to Nightmare Chronicles. If you're enjoying the story, drop a like and hit subscribe button. Your support really motivates me to create more videos like this. They say there are certain things in life you should never bring into your home, a cursed mirror being one of them. My tale begins innocently enough. It was the kind of thing I laughed at, really. Who would believe a mirror could be cursed? But here I am, staring down at it even as I write this, wondering what fate awaits me now. I was at an estate sale when I found it. An antique mirror, the glass foggy, its edges tarnished. The ornate frame was delicate, cracked in some places, with faint carvings that looked like faintly screaming faces. I felt a strange pull toward it, a whisper almost, though I shook it off. At home, I hung it in my living room, admiring its unusual beauty, though I noticed something unsettling. No matter where I stood, the reflections seemed different, as if the angles weren't quite right or the shadows stretched just a bit longer. At night, things got worse. I began to see things in the glass, faint figures, a blur of movement behind my own reflection. At first, I thought it was my imagination, some trick of the dim light. But then, one night, I awoke to soft whispers echoing through my room. I sat up, heart pounding, and realized the sounds were coming from the living room. I felt an irrational urge to look at the mirror, so I grabbed my flashlight and headed down. There, in the dim light, I saw a figure in the glass, staring back at me. It was me, but not me. It had my face, yet the expression was twisted, haunted, as though mocking me. In the following days, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was stress, lack of sleep, even a trick of the light. But then objects around my house began to move on their own. A picture frame on the mantel, a chair slightly pulled back from the table. Every time, I found myself drawn to the mirror as though it were watching me, orchestrating these strange occurrences. Desperate, I researched its origins and found a chilling story. The mirror, once owned by a 19th century spiritualist named Eleanor Shaw, was said to have been used in seances to capture spirits. Rumor had it that one seance went horribly wrong, trapping something dark within the mirror. After Eleanor's death, her family sold the mirror, and it changed hands many times, leaving a trail of misery, madness, and unexplained deaths. Despite the warnings, I thought I could handle it. But the more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. My reflections started changing. Small at first, like the odd angle of my smile, or the dark shadows under my eyes that looked deeper, almost hollow. I began to lose time, finding myself in front of the mirror, unsure of how long I'd been staring at my own reflection. My friends started noticing my strange behavior, the pale, tired look on my face, and one of them even joked that it was as if my reflection was stealing my life. In a last-ditch effort, I decided to cover the mirror with a sheet, hoping it would end whatever dark influence it had over me. But that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, a low, scraping sound, like nails dragging across glass. I rushed downstairs, and there it was. The sheet was on the floor, the mirror completely uncovered. My reflection stared back at me, but it didn't move when I did. I watched, frozen, as my reflection smirked, an evil glint in its eyes. And then slowly, it raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. I felt a cold, icy touch on my cheek, though I hadn't moved an inch. Terrified, I called a local paranormal investigator, someone who specialized in cursed objects. When he arrived, he took one look at the mirror and turned pale. He told me to leave the house immediately, saying the only way to rid myself of it was to bury it in hallowed ground, where it couldn't harm anyone again. I drove to an old cemetery at the edge of town, digging in the freezing soil as the sky grew darker. I buried it deep, hearing what sounded like whispers fading into the earth. As I walked away, I could feel the weight lift, my mind finally clear. But even now, as I write this, I wonder if the mirror's curse is truly gone, or if it's waiting, patiently, for the next fool who dares to uncover it. I never believed in haunted objects until I met Lily, the doll. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when I found her. I had been at an antique shop searching for something unique to add to my collection. In the back corner of the shop, hidden behind a dusty shelf, I noticed her. A porcelain doll with wide, glassy eyes and a tiny, stitched smile. She was dressed in a faded, lace-trimmed gown, her brown hair tied in neat curls. The moment I saw her, a chill ran down my spine. I thought it was just the atmosphere of the shop, dark, old, filled with forgotten things. But there was something about Lily that felt different, something off. I couldn't resist. I bought her on the spot, my curiosity outweighing any sense of dread I felt. That night, I placed her on a shelf in my bedroom, her eyes always staring directly at me. At first, I told myself it was silly. But as the days went by, strange things began to happen. The temperature in my room dropped, even when the rest of the house was warm. I started to hear soft giggling in the middle of the night, a high-pitched sound that made my skin crawl. I thought it was just the wind or the house settling, but the giggles grew louder, more distinct, and closer. Then came the whispers. I would wake up to the softest murmurings, like a voice just on the edge of hearing. But no one was there. I asked a few friends to come over, trying to dismiss it all as my imagination. But when they entered the room with the doll, they grew uncomfortable. One of them, Maria, even swore she saw Lily's eyes move. At first, I laughed it off, thinking it was a trick of the light or a momentary lapse in vision. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. I began to see Lily's eyes shift when I wasn't looking directly at her. And every night, she seemed to be in a slightly different position. Her head tilting as though she were watching me, her tiny fingers curled in unnatural ways. It wasn't long before I learned the history of the doll. I found an old newspaper article hidden inside one of her pockets. It was a story about a young girl, Lily, who had passed away under mysterious circumstances in the early 1900s. According to the article, her family had been heartbroken by her death, but it was the details that made my blood run cold. They mentioned that Lily had been known to play with a porcelain doll, a doll that had disappeared along with her. The article claimed that the doll had been sold many years later to collectors, always being passed from owner to owner, each reporting strange occurrences. I was horrified. Lily, the doll I had purchased, was the same one from the story. The realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the giggles and whispers, getting louder with each passing hour. The worst part? I started feeling her presence when I wasn't even in the room. I could sense her, as though she were waiting, watching, always just behind me. Desperate, I tried everything I could think of to get rid of her. I placed her in a box and left her on the porch, but the next morning she was back on the shelf, exactly where I had left her. I burned sage, I even tried to bury her, but no matter what I did, she always returned. My nights were filled with nightmares, and my days became a blur of exhaustion. The whispers turned into voices, full sentences that echoed in my head. "Come play with me," they would say. "We can have fun together." I began to lose my mind, my sanity slipping with each passing day. One night, I snapped. I grabbed Lily and held her close, my hands shaking with terror. "Why won't you leave me alone?" I shouted. The temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that my breath fogged in the air. Then, to my horror, Lily's eyes moved. They blinked. The tiny stitched mouth twisted into a smile. "You're mine now," the voice whispered, and I felt an icy grip around my heart. I couldn't take it anymore. I locked her in a trunk, sealing it tight with rope, and threw it into the deepest part of the lake. I never wanted to see her again. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I hear the giggling. It's faint, but it's there, and I know that she's still out there somewhere. Lily's curse will never be broken. I can't escape it. I just wonder, who will be the next to find her? It was my grandmother who first told me about the music box, though at the time I thought it was just one of her many ghost stories. I was only a child, and she would often speak of her family heirlooms, how they carried their own dark history. But the music box stood out among them, shrouded in secrecy. It had been passed down through generations, from her great-grandmother to her, and now to me. She said it was beautiful, that the tune it played was haunting, and that the box itself was the cause of untold sorrow. I was 13 when my grandmother gave it to me. She pressed it into my hands with a warning, her eyes clouded with fear. Never open it after midnight, she told me, and never, under any circumstances, let it play for too long. Of course, I didn't listen. As soon as she handed it to me, I admired its intricate craftsmanship, the tiny carvings of angels on the lid, the delicate gold accents, and the faded velvet interior. It looked harmless enough, though there was a weight to it, something I couldn't explain. Later that night, I couldn't resist the temptation. I wound the key at the back and opened the lid. The soft, haunting melody that poured from it was unlike anything I'd ever heard. At first, it was soothing, like a lullaby, but then something strange began to happen. The room felt colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. I felt as if someone was standing behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Shivers ran down my spine. I closed the box, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, as if emanating from within my very mind. Panic gripped me. I slammed the lid shut, but the melody didn't stop. It was as if the box had a life of its own. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing the tune in my dreams, a twisted, distorted version of the lullaby. It played over and over, growing more frantic each time. The next morning, I noticed something odd. My reflection in the mirror seemed off. I wasn't sure how to describe it at first, but my face looked older, more worn. I shook it off as my imagination, but the strange occurrences continued. I began hearing footsteps at night, faint but deliberate, walking across the floorboards when I was alone in my room. Each time I would look, but no one was there. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing day. I told myself it was just stress, that I was imagining things. But then one evening, I awoke to a cold hand gripping my shoulder. I turned, but there was no one there. The music box sat on my dresser, the lid slightly ajar. I didn't remember leaving it like that. Trembling, I approached it. The tune began to play once again. But this time it was different. It wasn't a lullaby anymore. It was a distorted, dissonant melody, as if it were calling out to something. Then the room darkened, and I could see it. Figures moving in the shadows, their faces hidden in the dark, watching me. I froze, unable to move, unable to speak. The figures came closer, their presence suffocating, and I heard a voice whisper from the depths of the box. "You opened it. Now it's too late." I tried to close it again, but the lid wouldn't budge. It was as if an invisible force was holding it open. Panic overwhelmed me, and in a fit of terror, I threw the box across the room, shattering it against the wall. The music stopped, but the silence that followed was deafening. The shadows receded, and the figures disappeared, but the fear still lingered. The house was quiet, but the unease remained. For days, I could still hear faint echoes of the melody, as if it were playing from a distance. It followed me, creeping into my thoughts, distorting my dreams. The cursed music box had left a mark on me, and I realized with horror that the curse didn't end when the box was destroyed. I began to feel the presence of something, someone, always lurking just beyond my vision. I tried to leave the house, but every time I did, I felt the chill in the air, the soft whispers that followed me. The curse had claimed me. My grandmother's warnings echoed in my mind, but it was too late. There was no escape now. I had always been wary of dolls. Their glassy eyes, frozen smiles, it was as though they were waiting for something, watching. But when I stumbled upon a porcelain doll at a yard sale, I couldn't resist. It was old, perhaps from the early 1900s, with delicate hands and a chipped face, but there was something oddly captivating about it. The seller claimed it had been in her family for generations, but she was eager to part with it. "I've had enough of its strange happenings," she said, laughing nervously. I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, it was just a doll. I placed it on a shelf in my living room, a little oddity among my other antique finds, and tried to ignore the chill I felt whenever I glanced at it. But soon, I began to notice strange things. Every time I walked into the room, the doll's eyes seemed to be looking at me, different, more focused, almost as though they were following my movements. I told myself it was nothing, that I was simply imagining things. But then, one evening, I caught something I couldn't explain. I was reading on the couch when I heard a faint scratching sound. It came from the direction of the shelf where the doll sat. I turned to look, and for a brief moment, I saw its head twitch. Not just a small shift, but a definite, unnatural movement. I froze. Was it my imagination? Or was the doll alive? In the days that followed, I could feel an eerie presence whenever I was near it. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, a sense of dread heavy in the air, and the doll would be staring at me from across the room. Its eyes seemed darker, almost soulless. Then, strange things began to happen around the house. Objects would shift positions without explanation. And once, I woke to find all the lights in my house flickering, as though something was toying with me. The final straw came one afternoon when I left the house for a few hours. When I returned, I found that the doll had moved. It was no longer on the shelf. Instead, it was sitting upright on the floor, facing the door as if waiting for me to return. I didn't know what to do, so I researched the doll's history, hoping to find some explanation. What I discovered was far worse than I could have imagined. The doll had been owned by a woman named Beatrice Harper, who, in the late 1800s, was accused of witchcraft and was executed. Before her death, she supposedly cursed the doll, claiming it would watch over her family and bring misfortune to anyone who dared to own it. Beatrice's descendants reported strange occurrences, family members falling ill, their houses catching fire, and inexplicable deaths. Over time, the doll passed through many hands, each owner mysteriously meeting an untimely end. As I read this, I could feel the air around me growing colder, as if the house itself was holding its breath. That night, I couldn't sleep. The doll's eyes seared into my mind. At 3 a.m., I woke up to hear whispers, soft, low voices that seemed to come from all directions. I sat up, heart pounding, and realized they were coming from the doll. It was sitting at the edge of my bed now, its eyes glowing faintly. I couldn't move, paralyzed by fear. Then it happened. The doll spoke. "You shouldn't have taken me," it whispered, its voice sweet yet hollow. "Now you will pay." I screamed, but the room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing down. I tried to run, but the doll's eyes held me in place. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were coming from inside my head. In that moment, I knew I had to rid myself of it, or I would be the next victim of its curse. I grabbed the doll, and despite the overwhelming feeling that it was trying to pull away from me, I ran out into the night. I drove to the outskirts of town, to an old abandoned cabin that no one had lived in for decades. I buried the doll deep beneath the floorboards, praying that it would never return. As I walked away, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still hear whispers in the dark, and I wonder if I made the right choice, or if the doll is still watching, waiting for the next moment when it will finally claim me. It was a rainy afternoon when I stumbled upon the painting. It was hidden in a small, dusty antique shop at the end of an alley I'd never noticed before. The rain had driven me inside, seeking refuge from the storm, and there, in the corner, behind a stack of old books, was the painting. At first, I didn't notice anything odd about it. Just a simple landscape, the kind you'd expect to see in a forgotten corner of an estate sale. It depicted a dark, moody forest with twisted trees, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. A narrow, winding path cut through the center, leading toward a distant, shadowy figure, cloaked in black. What drew me to it wasn't its beauty. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone when I stared at it. Something in the brushstrokes made me feel like I was being watched. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a hunched back and a raspy voice, noticed my interest and approached. "It's an old piece," he said, his eyes glinting strangely in the dim light. "A painting from the early 1800s. It's said to be cursed, though." He chuckled, but there was an edge to his voice. I wasn't one to believe in superstitions, so I dismissed his warning, paying him little attention as I purchased the painting. As soon as I brought it home, I noticed that something was off. The room felt colder. The shadows seemed deeper, more alive. I hung the painting on the wall, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure in the painting was moving, just at the edge of my vision. Whenever I glanced away, it seemed to shift, its dark cloak fluttering as if stirred by an unseen wind. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't ignore the sense of unease that grew with each passing day. Things began to escalate shortly after. At night, I would hear whispers, faint, incomprehensible voices, coming from the direction of the painting. It started softly, like a distant murmur, but as the days went on, the voices became louder, clearer. They were now urgent, frantic, as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. One evening, as I stood in front of it, I could swear I saw movement in the forest behind the figure. The branches shifted, the path seemed to stretch further into the distance, and the figure's face, once blurred, became clearer. It was a man. His eyes glinted with malice, his mouth twisted into a cruel, silent sneer. I couldn't tear myself away. My mind screamed at me to look away, but I was frozen, entranced by the painting. The next few days were a blur. I started seeing things around my house, shadows moving in the corners of my vision, whispers in the halls, objects out of place. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, standing at the edge of the path, waiting. I contacted the shopkeeper, desperate for answers, but when I reached the shop, I found it locked up tight, the windows dark. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. As I turned to leave, I spotted a small note on the door, hastily scribbled in black ink. "Do not trust the painting, it seeks a soul." I rushed home, but it was too late. The painting was no longer just a picture. It had become a gateway. I could feel it. The whispers had turned into voices, loud, demanding voices, pleading for me to come closer. I could hear the figure in the painting, his voice cutting through the silence, calling my name. That night, as I tried to sleep, the figure moved. The path in the painting widened, and the figure stepped off of it, his eyes locking onto mine. His expression twisted into a grin. I could hear his footsteps, distant at first, but growing louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew he was coming. I knew that the curse was real. He had been trapped in that painting for centuries, but now he was free, and he wanted me. I tried to burn the painting. I tried to throw it out, to destroy it in any way I could, but it was as though the very fabric of reality was fighting against me. The flames would not touch it. It would not rip. It remained as it was, unchanged, unyielding. The only thing I could do was leave. But I couldn't escape. The moment I crossed the threshold of my door, I saw him, standing at the end of the path in the painting. And he was no longer just a figure on a canvas. He had stepped into the real world. I've moved away since then, but I know he's still out there. I can feel him, and I can't help but wonder who the painting will claim next. I've heard stories about this curse, of course. The man in the painting, the one who called himself Elias, is said to have been a murderer in his past life. He was a traveler who wandered the land, taking lives for sport. When he was finally caught, he was condemned to live forever in the painting, where he would remain until someone foolish enough to take him in let him free. It seems that I was that fool. The shopkeeper's warning was too late. I am trapped now, as he once was, a part of the curse that will never be undone.